Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to do The Butterfly Effect. So, this is a movie that did so well that garnered a sequel that probably no one even knows exists. So, we have me to have seen this movie a long time ago and revisiting it currently. I'm like, man, this movie is dark. Just the tone of the film was to be just so dark and bleak and hopeless. And but I was still intrigued about it. I was still interested in it. And so we come into this wanting me to possibly compare it to, like, obviously, like Donnie Darko, which is technically a time travel like film, which of course The Butterfly Effect is a time traveling film, and the Dennis Quaid film Frequency, which of course is a very flimsy time travel like thing, which is the only actual time travel part of that film is to be exchanging future knowledge to the past between two people sharing a radio that can somehow connect to the future. So I would go on and state, like, from Frequency, how it became a movie and then went to being a show. I think The Butterfly Effect would possibly work as a show. And to me, I would feel that more than likely they would probably exchange the lead to be a female lead instead of a male lead, because we've already had two attempts at a male lead for this, and probably people would probably forget what this is and have to be reminded of what it is, and so maybe it'll go on and work out better with The Butterfly Effect having a female lead with it. Just my thoughts. But so I had also gone on and seen the sequel of this film, and if the first movie was very, like, blue collar and stuff like that, we kind of in the sequel have much more of, like, a suit and tie approach to The Butterfly Effect. And also, like, I feel like the sequel, like, doesn't feel anywhere similar to its first film, because it's like, man, yeah, that movie was so dark. Let's try and put something else out there, but try to do it drastically different. And that probably didn't go on and help this sequel much, and kind of had people just not even realize it existed. So we have in this film, now kind of teeing it up for you all, we have a guy named Evan who it seems is to have certain time periods that is to build up to the Ashton Kutcher Evan character. We go on in certain parts of this movie and have when Evan is trying to ask people, hey, do you remember this scene? Do you remember this memory? Do you remember this? And there's a lot of people that are trying as much as possible to not tell Evan what it is they saw, because of course we would find out that that one memory would have to go on and be so heavily adjusted throughout the film, and hence why they can't go on and really just state anything whatsoever. And so it just kind of becomes like a very goofy part of the film where we have certain characters bringing things up just for them to go on and be denied information, because of course they can't just go on and talk about the blackout with Evan. So we have Evan that comes to find out that he is to lose time in the past to then regain it in his later iteration of the character. And we come to find that Evan will eventually go back in time during those missed blackouts and see what it is that he lost via those times, and why he was to go on and hold a knife here, or be choked out there, or to be dragging somebody off within the woods, and he is very baffled and confused by all of that. So we come to find that Evan going back in time makes him realize that maybe he can go on and completely adjust his past to all of a sudden have his entire life be skewed into a completely different timeline than where he leaves off last, to hopefully make his life better, or to possibly realize that it's like, well, like the timeline that I skewed to, like, it is great and all, but what if it could be better? And we start to just consistently have Evan get addicted to going back in time, trying to adjust his life, hoping that it'll come out better. And we have a certain specific part of the film where Evan goes on and he's just like, you know what, like, I'm kind of at a point where I'm like kind of giving up. Every time that I feel that everything is going to go great, it just goes worse. And so that kind of tells you where our story for our characters might be heading. Plus, I want to throw back, of course, a little Smallville quote, because of course I remember that show. And we would, of course, have Jor-El talking to Clark and telling him, it's like, well, hey, when there is death, there is always death. And so, yeah, like, what you think is doing is all good and well, but where is that bad going to shift if you're going to go on and think that you can just kind of get away with making the perfect life for yourself? There has to be some kind of like changing of goalposts. There needs to be, like, the bad needs to go somewhere. The thing that you tried to change, there needs to be some kind of effect of that. And so that's where I can go on and just kind of find this to be interesting. And it also just kind of makes you think of like stuff like Groundhog's Day, where we come to find that Bill Murray's character is trying to make the perfect day, and how you could probably go on and think that that is not really all that possible, but somehow Bill Murray's character just pulls it off from his repeated loop a day, and that goes on to finally just have him go to the following day. So, anyways, with that said, I believe that this movie is on HBO Max right now, and so my overall grading of this movie is Butterfly Effect is bad, but I found it to be interesting. So, like, it's right in that really weird buffer of a thing where it's between, like, okay and bad. Like, it just feels interesting enough to have me just want to squeakingly want to give it a thumbs up, but also there's, for me to state that this movie is so dark that, like, I cannot just go on and just want to shift that thumb all the way to a point of me putting it on the screen. So, so take this one with what I have to have claimed upon it. That it could be interesting, so check it out if you've never seen it before. But go into a side of caution that this might not be the greatest movie that you've seen of all time. So, and maybe there's somebody out there that just weirdly loves this movie for some goofy reason, or hates it, I don't know. But to each their own, I'm going to go on and state, if you do not have HBO Max, you can watch this movie in an app called Zelifonic. Zelivonic. I believe that's how it's spelled. But at the end of the day, hopefully you can say that you can watch this movie for absolutely free by checking out that app, which I'm hoping is still on the Google Play Store. Hopefully you can watch that and more for absolutely free. So I'm going to go on and just double five this bad boy out, because I think it's about that time to just go into spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So in the very beginning of this, we find that Evan, and this is a very weird, bizarre way to start this film, because we have this movie to be 2 hours, and my just knee-jerk thing is like, what the heck was the beginning of the movie all about? Because we would have to have waited so long to get back to that, and with all the jumbled mess of what is all going on, I'm like, what the heck was that? Why even do that in the beginning of the film? But so, in the beginning of this movie, we have Evan, who is running around in this mental hospital, trying to make his way to this office where he's to put this kind of couch in front of the door, and he is desperately writing this note saying, it's like, well, hey, like, if I don't make it, like, I just went back to try and save her. And so we obviously cut from that, and now we show 13 years earlier. The quickest, just bizarrest, just way to open up a movie, I felt. So, 13 years earlier, we have a younger Evan who is going on and playing with a dog, who we find out even the dog will have an important stake in this film somewhere later on. I don't remember the name of the dog, but he has some stakes going on. So, we come to find that Evan is to go on and see that his mother is working on their car, and so Evan is stating, is it possible for their father to come and see him because it's parents' night for school? And we, of course, have Audrey or Andrea, I'm not quite sure which, Andrea, my bad. We have her going on and stating that, well, your father can't just go on and get out of where he is at, and, like, I'm sorry, it doesn't quite work that way, because we'll find out in the later film that Evan's father is Jason, and he's in a mental hospital, and he, of course, cannot just go on and leave whenever he would like to. So, we have Andrea that goes on to deliver Evan to school, and we come to find out that Miss Boswell is trying to alert Andrea that she needs her to see something that, of course, Evan had did. Andrea is like, well, can't this wait till later? And Miss Boswell is like, I'm sorry, but no, like, this needs your attention now. So we have Andrea that goes with Miss Boswell to go into this class, to then have them see a drawing that Evan had gone on to make. This is a drawing, of course, as Evan stabs into certain people, and that is to be a very dark drawing, and also there, of course, is to be so many kind of different, like, horror films and all these kinds of things where we would always go on and see, like, a kid who is to draw this kind of horrific drawing or certain carnage or whatever that he's seen. And so, yeah, like, that just happens quite often to kind of make an unsettling imagery. So Andrea is confused about, like, are you sure this is even my son who drew this? And we, of course, have Andrea that keeps the drawing, as Mrs. Boswell mentions that she talked to Evan about the drawing, and he had no recollection of even drawing it. So, because of blackouts. The time of blackouts. So, Andrea and Evan go to the Sunnyvale Institute, which we'll find also is to house Jason, Evan's dad. So, we have Andrea that asks if Evan is getting his father's sickness from Dr. Redfield. So, Dr. Redfield wants Evan to just write everything down in a notebook or piece of paper or something somewhere, so he can hope that this could possibly jog his memory, or just kind of keep a memory of what it is that he could remember. So, Evan writes about going to meet Kaylee and Tommy, and we'll find out what they're going to do is a little bit weird, because of course it is. And also their dad, Mr. Miller. Andrea walks through the house and all of a sudden notices that Evan is holding a knife upon his hand. And Andrea is very confused, like, okay, Evan, like, what's going on? What are you doing with the knife? Evan all of a sudden drops it, and he is utterly confused, and we have both Evan and Andrea who embrace and hug. So, we have Andrea and Evan that drive their way to Mr. Miller's house, and for what I had just seen, I'm like, man, like I guess Andrea is just okay with leaving her knife wielding son at Mr. Miller's house. Yeah, okay. So, but Mr. Miller just kind of welcomes Evan to their place as Andrea gives phone numbers to Mr. Miller, as we have like Mr. Miller who's like greeting them and very nice, and like they toss the football around. Hey, buddy, yeah. Like I know that you've never really had a dad in your life, even though you can only have seen your dad via photos or pictures or whatever that we'll talk about later. So we go and have Evan who goes in the backyard, and all of a sudden Kaylee and Tommy are in this weird wardrobe of sorts that is to make them have a certain theme going on. Kaylee mentions Miller had gotten a new camera and getting a little dark all up in here and creepy. Miller tells Evan he is the star of the movie, as Tommy's like, well, wait a minute. And Mr. Miller's like, no, like, no, Tommy, like, Evan is going to be the star of the film. So, Miller wants Evan to keep what they do here a secret, and I would want to just go and tell Mr. Miller, you can go secret your frickin' self. Evan next sees himself standing next to Kaylee as Tommy is twisting the head of a doll in the background, as we realize that something awful had possibly happened here, but we don't know exactly what, because this is the blackout time, and we then have Evan next, who is to all of a sudden just be standing next to Kaylee, and has Tommy just twisting that doll for some goofy reason. So, we all of a sudden have Mr. Miller that's talking to Evan and telling him that he's being a bad boy. And Mr. Redfield, we kind of cut to the doctor here. We have Dr. Redfield talks to Andrea that signs are negative that Evan has lesions or tumors, and the blackouts might just be stress related, like I kind of said earlier on. So Andrea asks what Evan could really be stressed out about because of the age that he is, and like, what does he have to worry about? He's just a young kid. Like, he doesn't have to worry about bills or finances or how to go on and buy low and sell high in the stock market. Redfield says that it might be related to his father, and Andrea knows Evan hasn't or has been asking about his father lately. So Redfield says that Evan can meet up with his dad, and they can put certain medications in place. They state the word sedative, which immediately when I hear the word sedative, I'm like, doesn't that completely like knock somebody out? Like, doesn't that completely put them to sleep? But I guess when giving a very low dosage of sedatives, I guess that just kind of like maybe like flattens somebody out or something. I don't know. It just seemed kind of weird when they said the word sedative here. But they can put medications in place for Jason so that way Evan can go on and see his father. So we next see that Evan is on the road with his mother to go on and see Jason, Evan's dad. Evan writes in his notebook about his dad being crazy, but Evan still kind of hopes that Evan's dad, Jason, will let him call him dad. And so we have the two of them make their way to Sunnyvale, and we go on to have Dr. Redfield telling Evan his dad will be a little woozy, a little sleepy. But hey, still, like, try and make an effort. So Evan goes in the room to meet up with his dad, Jason. As they start the conversation off, Jason asks Evan if he's seen pictures of him. The next thing we know, because blackout time happens, Jason is choking his kid. I guess that whole little crazy thing was no joke. Jason is a little loony. He's a little wound up. But so, as Jason is going on and choking onto Evan, we all of a sudden have Jason getting hit on the back of the head. So hard so that the back of his head starts bleeding. And we realize that I guess that is a wound that Jason cannot come back from. And so we go on to have Jason, who is to have a funeral here. We have Kaylee that is to stand next to Evan, holding his hand, trying to comfort him, so on and so forth. So Andrea goes on to drive both Evan and Kaylee home. And so we all of a sudden go 6 years later, where all of these kiddos are to be 13, and we all of a sudden add a friend in the mix, who of course is Lenny. So it seems a little weird that we get this character kind of late in the game, but I guess it is just what it is. It kind of would make sense that a lot of time has passed, and all of a sudden there's a additional friend here. So we go on into having these characters in this basement, in the Miller's basement, and these kids are all 13. The funny thing of it is we have to try and realize that all these kids from the time lapsing periods are to not all look the same. And so it is kind of just interesting how we go on here to have like characters like Tommy, who like in one thing to another, like his hair might change, or we could go on and have Lenny from like the young kid to an adult, just kind of his hair might not be the same, or Kaylee, of course, could kind of look all different kinds of other places and so on and so forth. But hey, like, when really looking at it, this movie only had a certain budget also. So, we have Evan, who is drawing a sketch of Kaylee, and Evan and Lenny are wondering what Tommy is up to, as Tommy is trying to retrieve a stick of dynamite, which he calls a blockbuster, because he must have went into renting too many Blockbuster videos at one point in time. Is Blockbuster a term for a stick of dynamite? Is there a different lingo or something that I'm not aware of? Anyways, so we see that these kids are making their way to this house that bizarrely has a mailbox that is the exact same likeness as the person's house. So these people obviously had way too much freaking money that they decided to make a replica mailbox that looked like their house. It's just absurd. So they must have had mailbox money. So Tommy gives Lenny the blockbuster as he wants no part of it. Lenny doesn't. Lenny doesn't want to do it. But so Evan goes on and puts the cigarette fuse on the dynamite, but like, well, hey, that'll give you like 2 minutes. All the time in the world. So as they all wait for the explosion, Tommy looks at Evan, who is, of course, covering Kaylee's ears. Tommy is just kind of like, ugh, about that. As we further and further realize that Tommy wants Kaylee to seemingly not be with Evan. I don't know if Tommy doesn't want Kaylee to be with anybody whatsoever, but it just seems to be that way. Or maybe Tommy doesn't think that Evan is good enough for his sister. Or maybe there's also something very weird going on between both Tommy and Kaylee, because it seems that when we get to a certain part of this film, we really do have Tommy being more and more weird and creepy anyways. Because maybe he is to be overly scarred as a child, and they never really put up certain parts of that film. They just kind of have to really just kind of give you some kind of very dark like dialogue that it's like, okay, but what does that really mean though? But either way, we would want to probably see it in the movie anyways. But still, like, I thought that they should go on and to have explained it just a little bit more somewhere. But anyways, it is what it is. We just have to kind of assume. So anyways, we all of a sudden, because blackout time, appear in this woods with Evan and Tommy carrying Lenny for some reason that we don't quite understand, which we'll understand later. Evan all of a sudden drops, and so does Lenny, and Evan is very confused of where he is, because of course, another blackout spot. So, we have Andrea that is to make her way to her home to find out that there is an ambulance nearby. And so Andrea runs to her kids to ask them what had happened. We, of course, have Tommy, who is to state that, oh yeah, we were all together building a fort, and like, and we didn't hear or see a thing. Didn't we, everybody? Didn't we? Tell her the truth. And we, of course, would have Andrea that's like, I don't believe you, Tommy. So we have Andrea that immediately goes to Evan, and it's like, well, hey, Evan, tell me the truth. And Evan's like, I don't know. I have no clue what happened. And we would, of course, have Andrea that's like, Evan, like, don't use your blackouts as an excuse to not know what happened. And Evan's like, and he just starts crying. He just starts getting emotional. And we would go on to have Andrea that's like, oh, okay, so he's not telling the truth. He's being honest. So, like, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So, Evan writes about what happened, putting his hands over Kaylee's ears in his little notebook. And so, Evan runs out of ink in his pen and starts looking around. I think this is when he's in his, like, attic. And he all of a sudden starts to look around for a pen, and he all of a sudden notices this massive case that has his father's name on it, Jason. And so we have Evan that is start to look through this case of Jason's to realize that there are certain records that are to even state that not only was Jason crazy, but also Evan's grandfather was crazy also. So this kind of time-traveling ability runs in the genes, it seems. So Evan goes to Sunnyvale Institution to get hypnotized by Dr. Redfield. We, of course, have Dr. Redfield, who is trying to focus on Evan, and the whole time that Evan was in that woods, like what had happened, that they can kind of treat this like a movie. They can kind of rewind, or they can fast forward, or they can pause at any moment to try and understand what Evan had gone on to do here. And if we can't get this information through his subconscious, then maybe we can get the information from him when he's not conscious. So we go on to have Evan that talks about him putting his hands over Kaylee's ears, and we had Dr. Redfield who's like, well, were you hurting Kaylee? And Evan's like, no, I was trying to protect her. And so we all of a sudden have Evan that states that he saw a car coming. It's like, okay, like, well, tell me about the car. And then all of a sudden we have Evan that states that he's back in the woods again, and he is dragging off Lenny, and like his nose starts to heavily bleed. Evans does. And so we, of course, then have Dr. Redfield that is trying to wake up Evan from his nose bleeding a blood. And so, I always like to just say the word blood and just kind of goofily state it, anyways. But moving on. So Redfield wakes Evan out of him being hypnotized as Evan's like, well, hey, did it work? No, not so much. So we have Evan that makes his way to a movie theater with his friends to go on and see the film Seven. Like, that sounds like a great, rousing film to have a bunch of kids go to, right? Not so much. So, we have these kids make their way to the movie theater, and so Tommy goes in the movie theater just making fun of this very obese character that, of course, is in the glutton part of the movie Seven. Of course, if you don't remember the movie Seven, it's a whole like investigation of the seven deadly sins, and we start to have our characters Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt start to figure that out during the film. And it was an interesting film, even though it was kind of like there's a lot of gross out things going on in that film. But so anyways, I thought it was rather interesting. And of course, we don't actually get to the scene where it's like, where's the box? What's in the box? That, of course, is the most iconic scene from that film. If you don't go on to remember anything else. So, moving on. So, Kaylee is to go on and just kind of be disgusted by a part of this film, and she walks out. Evan follows her, and so Kaylee is to ask Evan if he really could not remember anything about the whole Blockbuster situation, and Evan tells her no. And so we have Kaylee that's like, well, wow, like, you lucked out there. So we have Evan find out that Kaylee has a bruise, and so Kaylee shows Evan this bruise because, come to find out, once Kaylee's father had known what had happened to this woman, we had both Tommy and Kaylee that ended up getting beaten by their dad to kind of take it out on them. So we, of course, have Evan that tells Kaylee that she deserves better, a better dad and a better brother, and maybe a cat named Pookie. I don't know. Trying to make some kind of light of this film because, man, it's a very dark tunnel that we go in here, and just wait till a moment here. So after Evan is to talk to Kaylee, they then kiss. Tommy all of a sudden very upset by the fact that the two of them are kissing, and so Tommy's like, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I'm gonna go over there, I'm gonna beat you. And we all of a sudden find that a guy is to intervene in this conversation and hear the words, what are you doing? And the guy states, well, hey, I'm buying popcorn, as he trips Tommy. Tommy all of a sudden, when he gets up, is to just start beating this guy up, just punching the crap out of him, because Tommy is a creepy jerk. All while Tommy is beating up on this guy, he's looking at Evan like the whole time, and he's smiling. I'm beating him up, but I'm looking at you. And so that thing kind of reminded me of like the superhero movie. I always bring this up because there's some goofy scenes where it could be related. But anyways, so there's a superhero scene where the Dragonfly is having to beat up a couple of guys, and it's to notice his love interest. And so while he's kind of slamming this guy to the ground, Dragonfly is looking up at this girl the whole entire time as they have like F me eyes looking at one another, or they're just in love. So we go on to have Dragonfly, who is to kind of look at this girl and look, and so it's very weird and funny. But for here, like, it doesn't work that way, but I also just like, man, this is so goofy and so odd. Moving on. So Tommy is to end up getting thrown out by some security guards who go on and grab him. I didn't know a movie theater had security guards, but I don't know. I guess you would probably have a movie theater. They'd probably have like a number of ushers. They'll probably realize like, hey, somebody's trying to sneak into other movies. And so maybe that could be a rational thing in my brain. But anyways, Tommy smiles as Kaylee and Evan uh, what? Oh, so yeah, so Tommy smiles, and the one thing that I stated while he smiled, I'm like, can you taste the creepiness coming off of Tommy? That's what I said there. But anyways, Andrea is driving Evan home, and she goes on to break the news to him that they're freaking moving. Like she's had enough with this town. She's kind of lost Jason, and so now she just wants to go on and move away because she even herself realizes how creepy this movie is. Both Evan and Kaylee talk about how different Tommy is now as they are to make their way to Lenny's house. Because, of course, Lenny and Kaylee want to talk to, or Evan and Kaylee want to talk to Evan and get them to kind of just come out because Evan is like, well, hey, like I'm moving soon and I want to go on and see like my friends one last time. So they make their way to Lenny's house and they're talking about like, well, hey, was Lenny let out recently? And so I'm like, well, what was he in prison? Like, but come to find out he was temporary in a mental hospital just because he needed it. I could understand. So, Evan and Kaylee go to Lenny's window, so they can talk. Lenny talks about he couldn't really sleep, with all the frequent screams, and I'm like, well, yeah, I'm sure you would have to go on and binge watch all those Scream movies because there's 6 of them now, and so you probably wouldn't be able to sleep with that, right? Man, I was trying to get this marathon. I was trying to crank it out, and he was talking about the crazy screams at the mental hospital while they were making their way through this junkyard. So Evan, Kaylee, and Lenny go on to find that also Tommy is to be in this junkyard also, putting this dog of Evan's in this sack and is to pour flammable liquid over the sack because this movie isn't twisted enough. If we can just go on and get like a dog and a cat and another dog going on this kind of adventure to find their way back home, homeward bound or some crap. Can we go on and just have some babies and some bunnies or whatever just talking in the background somewhere? Can we just lighten the mood of this movie to somehow? Anyways, so Tommy put Evan's dog in the sack and Tommy hits Kaylee and Evan with some wood. So I've stated the word sack and then I've stated the word wood. We all of a sudden find out that Evan is to be dropped to on all fours while we have Tommy who's hitting him with some wood. Just the weird, wordage of that just sounded funny to me, so I went with it. And we all of a sudden have Evan who is to try to see if Kaylee's okay. But I think weirdly here, we all of a sudden have Evan that states Haley instead of Kaylee here. Because immediately when I'm rewatching the scene, like I hear Evan that says the word Haley. And I'm like, so this guy doesn't even know who this girl is. But anyways, because of course, like in the scene of the moment, like more than likely they're just like, that was good enough. So Tommy tells Evan to kiss her, as again Evan blacks out to wake up on the ground, hurt. The sack is now burnt as Evan and Lenny cry for the loss of this dog, and more carnage has happened. We then transition to have Evan and Andrea, who are in their U-Haul, driving off, as Kaylee is trying to run to the U-Haul truck as this is happening, we of course have Evan, who is to slap his notebook upon the window, and we of course have the reading of that stating, "I will come back for you." But it also would have been funny in my brain to go on and have Kaylee, who never went on and was fast enough to get to this U-Haul truck and be able to read this sign, and she'd be like, "I'll come what now?" Who did the what now? What did that say? So Evan, who is now Ashton Kutcher, because this is to be 7 years later, Evan talks to Professor Carter about a story confusion when he took this test. And we, of course, have Professor Carter that is to be like, you're cracking wise, you genius kid, you. All right. So we, of course, have Professor Carter that is taking a specific interest in Evan here. Like, well, hey, how is your memory experiment going? And Evan's like, well, like, it has to go well because I, of course, am selfishly going to have to need it work myself. So Evan goes to his dorm where he meets Thumper, a kind of emo-looking character, it seems, that is taking Evan's shirt and wiping it upon his own schwanz, his own manhood, it seems. So we are to go on and find that a leathered-up woman is to be pulling herself off of Thumper to then meet up with Evan, and it seems that this woman is very ticked off at Evan because, of course, she knew that Evan had ruined her grading curve in some class. So, from what I remember, what she said there. So, Evan, while looking at his goofy-looking worm experiment, is to talk to Thumper. It's like, well, hey, man, we need to go out. We need to have some fun. It's been 7 years since one of my blackouts, so I think it's about that time for us to get out of here and just celebrate. And we, of course, go on to have Evan, who is to grab onto Thumper's head and just kind of give him this, like, choke or noogie or whatever. And we have Thumper that's like, well, hey, man, like, don't mess with me. I'm post-coital. And so Evan's like, yeah, shut up. So they go to the bar and they find out that there is these fraternity guys that are going on and heckling Thumper because of the way he looks. And we come to find out that immediately Thumper and Evan, like, these guys seemingly are chick magnets. Immediately when they come to this bar, there are two women just flocking on them and want to know about their weird worm experiments for some goofy reason. So we go on to have Evan, who is to explain that these worms are part of a memory project that he's working on to make him seem rather smart to these women. So I think Thumper probably set him up for that. So that way it's like, well, hey, this guy's really intelligent. Like, yeah, girls, like, you better make a baby with this guy for how smart he is. So we all of a sudden continue to have these guys heckling Thumper to the point of Thumper taking this cue ball and smashing it into the heckler's table when he goes on and has his turn at the billiard table. Funny thing about billiard tables, if you were to ever buy one, they weigh about like 600 pounds, so good luck with that if you ever need to get a pool table in your life. Plus, also, most of those things would end up being broken a lot of the times anyways. So you would get often people that would buy these things to come to find out that they would be freaking broken. So you'd waste so much money on a thing that doesn't even look all that good. So anyways, moving on. So we have the frat guys that are upset about this ball coming to their table. And so when they get up, we of course have Thumper that breaks this cue stick off. And we have Evan that's like, well, I guess this game is yours, Thumper. So Evan and this girl go to the dorm as the girl is to notice a certain aroma of loving embrace. Did somebody in here? Did somebody do some loving? So, she is to go on and desperately hope that there is some kind of scented candle that they can light, or some kind of Febreze that Evan, of course, is to have, which, of course, he doesn't. And instead, this girl is to find some set of notebooks and be curious what Evan was to go on and write in it. And so we have this girl that it's like, okay, like, read me this notebook, read it to me. And Evan's like, well, I better get some action after I read you this passage. And so we go on to have Evan, who is to read a random passage, and that leads him to talk about the dog in the sack junkyard memory that he, of course, had blacked out at some point about. And come to find out, Evan gets sucked back into that time. Evan all of a sudden gets back into his younger self, very baffled and confused, as he goes on and gets hit by a piece of wood, as Lenny can't get the sack open. Tommy tells Evan, out of all the girls that he could have gone with, he had to go on and pick Tommy's sister. In all honesty, I would go on and tell Tommy, like, hey, there's a very limited girl pool in this town. It's either Kaylee or just nobody. When we go on, we find out later that it seems that Evan can, like, get every girl that he could ever want, and he's still going for Kaylee anyways. Very confusing, but either way, because it also seems that women are just kind of throwing themselves at Evan. But maybe Evan cannot go on and just find the one. And so that is what it is, sadly enough. So Evan wakes up, and so the girl is kind of ragging on Evan because he passed out. And we immediately have Evan that forgets about this girl and how he still could go on and get some love and some pleasing and caressing. And he instead runs off to go on to a road trip. Evan goes to see Lenny, and Evan at first goes on to talk to Lenny's mother, and then sees Lenny's room full of all of these model airplanes. And I'm like, oh my god, this is so sad. This guy probably never had a life, but once you go on and you see how Lenny is, you could probably understand that it seems that these model airplanes were the only calming thing that Lenny could actually have in his life. So, hey man, just model airplane it up. Like, as long as you have the means and the money to be able to do these things, then go on ahead, for somehow you must be doing well. Maybe you have a airplane model YouTube channel that you're like, hey man, like, I'm building all these, and like, that's how he just has his success. Who knows? This movie was done at this point. We don't have YouTube channel. I know, I get it, but still. But I just thought that this part of the movie was very sad. Evan asks Lenny about the time in the junkyard, and Lenny starts muttering something about he couldn't cut the rope. Evan asks Lenny if he remembers more about that whole thing. Lenny all of a sudden is to start to yell something that Tommy had said in the past. And it goes on to scare Evan so much so that he drops this plane that he was holding, and then he picks it back up. Lenny all of a sudden goes on to grab Evan, slamming him up against this bookcase, and is to mutter another thing that, of course, had been said. And so Evan's like, okay, I think that's my cue to just get out of here. I think that's my cue to leave, because, man, are you just not the guy that I thought you would be, who I could go on and talk about all this. So Evan goes back to his dorm to read his notebook to figure out when the blackouts had occurred, so that way he can kind of put little post-its to figure out if there is a possibility that he can go back into these times to revisit these moments. So Evan goes back to the Blockbuster memory. Evan drops his cigarette on his shirt as we see a woman driving up to her house with a baby to check her mailbox. The woman and baby die from the mailbox explosion as Evan is to finally realize what he missed from that blackout. So, Evan called Lenny to only get his mother, and the mother is going on complaining about how Lenny and Evan had created such a mess that she had to go on and take a while to clean that up. And Evan's trying to be very apologetic and so on and so forth. But anyways, like, Evan is not going to be able to talk to Lenny about this anyways. So Evan goes on to have a dinner with his mother. And so Evan has a whole agenda while going to dinner with his mom. And so he starts talking about Jason and was kind of curious if Jason ever gone on and kind of used his memories to try and fix anything from the past. And so Evan realizes that that is a sore subject for his mother as his mother just walks off from the dinner table. Evan goes on to follow his mother to find out that she is starting to smoke. And Evan's like, when did that start? So, because she had done it in the past, but I guess she's now just wanting just one cigarette to just kind of get herself away from this moment. So, we all of a sudden have Andrea that notices that there is a fortune teller, and she's like, well, hey, how about we go? And Evan's like, I don't know. And so Andrea's like, no, let's go. So they go seek out this fortune teller, and we come to find out that this fortune teller is to grab the hand of Evan to state that he has no timeline, that Evan should never have gone on and existed, and for some reason he is an existing person. So Andrea is to, of course, run off again from this. And so Evan is to ask his mother, it's like, well, like, what was she meaning by any of that? Like, it sounded kind of rather, like, strange and so on and so forth. So Andrea goes on to explain that Andrea had 2 kids prior to Evan, and they were stillborns, and they had died while Andrea had been giving birth to them. Which, by the way of this movie ending, we would have to go on and draw the conclusion. It's like, well, like, did they take the exact same route that Evan does by the end of this film to realize that people would have been better off if this character didn't exist for whatever reason? Oddly enough. So we had Andrea that was to assume that Evan wasn't going to make it, but somehow he became her miracle baby. Evan starts reading the notebook again after leaving his mother, as Thumper stops him and tells him, it's like, well, hey man, like, you're going to be worse off if you go on and you go back into time, and like that'll kind of foreshadow when eventually Evan will go back into time and come off worse off later down the road. So Evan finds where Kaylee works. Kaylee is to be working at a waitress at some diner somewhere, and while she's waiting at these tables, she ends up dropping these plates, and this man takes advantage when Kaylee's back is turned by slapping her on the butt. The tuchus! The rump room. So we have, of course, Evan, who is tempted to go into this diner, but then is to wait until Kaylee is to leave, until her shift's over. So Evan introduces himself to Kaylee, and they are kind of playing catch up and reminisce, like, "Oh, hey, yeah, like, how have you been? How have you been?" And they hug it out. So Evan is to go on and ask Kaylee about Tommy, and it seems that Tommy has spent some time in juvie and is to now be working at an auto parts. So yeah, like that guy was just headed to greener pastures, wasn't he? So Kaylee talks about her getting away from her dad. She goes on and emancipates herself at 15, and for some reason or another, she couldn't go on and live with her mother for some goofy reason, but it seems by the end of the film, we find that that is a different story for whatever reason. So Evan asks Kaylee about a memory that she, of course, would have that he wouldn't. So Evan asks about the Mr. Miller Robin Hood movie memory, and we have Kaylee that asks like why Evan was to just come to her to just stir up all this crap, and how he never went on and called her, and when he stated that he was going to come back for her at some point, and he never really did. So Evan gets a message from Professor Carter about a makeup essay, and also from Tommy, who is to leave a message stating that Kaylee took her own life after what they had talked about. Evan went to Kaylee's funeral, leaving the paper still that he held to this day, saying that I will come back for you. And he leaves it on her grave. Evan writes that it is possible to remove old scars by changing time, and so he's making an assessment of like, well, hey, if I can remove old scars, can I go on and change a lot more about my past? So Evan again starts to be tempted to read into his notebook. Evan goes back to the Robin Hood movie flashback. Mr. Miller talks about how they should go to the basement because it looks like a dungeon in there. Miller talks about kissing and adult stuff as Evan tells Kaylee to put her hands over her ears. Evan talks about this is Miller's reckoning. Ooh, scary. And that he will be watching over him, and what he's doing will leave his daughter, or lead his daughter to an early grave, and that he needs Miller to be a good father and discipline his son Tommy. Because if there's somebody that needs discipline, I guess it's really Tommy. Evan finds himself in Kaylee's fraternity in this alternate timeline because a lot has now changed to the point of us finding out that Evan is to now be enlined in a fraternity, and he has all these clothes to state that, and we have Kaylee who's in her own fraternity, and it seems that at one point Kaylee had come back to be with Evan and everything had worked out, and we have that huge amount of like time that has changed to, of course, where Evan is to get a huge amount of memories going into his head that is to have his nose bleed heavily. We'll start to realize that when we have Evan who has to go through a drastic timeline change, that he will go on and have these huge seizures or a lot of blood coming out of his nose. It'll get worse over time. So, hence why we should have Evan kind of as very rare as possible go into changing drastically a whole entire timeline, because that, of course, will go on and affect him greatly. So, anyways, we go on to have Evan, who has a nosebleed, and Kaylee is telling Evan, it's like, well, hey, maybe you should go to the bathroom and kind of clean that up. So Evan all of a sudden makes his way to this bathroom where he notices a girl completely getting out of the shower. Like, no moment of like, oh, I need to cover up because there's a guy in here. She's like, no, I'm going to flaunt my body and then I'll put on a towel. So we get to see some of that Gwen. And so we go on to have Evan, who is stating who Gwen is and that she had went to a bar with all of these fraternity guys and like they were heckling Thumper. And Gwen is like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, are you okay? Like, so we go on to realize that a lot has changed here. So we have Evan and Kaylee leave the sorority, and Evan asks about the camcorder memory as Miller, I guess, had gone on to buy that camcorder, but the following day had gotten rid of it. So it's like, aha. So, like, I guess he had changed that for the good. So Kaylee goes on and kisses Evan goodbye. So Evan calls his mom to get a message asking, no. So Evan calls his mom and then goes on to see that Thumper is walking by. We, of course, have Evan who is to ask Thumper, hey, what time is it? And we have Thumper who kind of gives the old-fashioned joke of like, well, hey, it's time for you to buy a new watch. It's like, well, hey, where's your Rolex? So, you fraternity goofer, you finding out that both Thumper and Evan are no longer on good terms and they're not friends. So, Evan goes on to meet up with Professor Carter and talks about that paper extension. And we, of course, have Professor Carter is like, who are you? Like, do I even have you in my class? And so Professor Carter goes on to tell Evan to just take a seat. And we all of a sudden have Evan who is talking to a fraternity brother named Hunter. And so we come to find out that Hunter's like, well, hey, man, did you study for this test? And Evan's like, oh, I don't know. And so Hunter is to kind of give Evan this piece of paper that is to be this cheat sheet. And so Evan asks Hunter possibly about like, well, hey, like, do you think that you can go on and do me a favor to help me with something with like Kaylee later on? And Hunter's like, no. Like, I'm not going to tell you, or I'm not going to have you like do any of that for, or Hunter states that he's not going to do any of that, but to force the pledges to do it anyways. So we have Evan that puts some new moves on Kaylee in the bedroom, and they talk about why Evan is so special in the past that led them to this moment. Evan transitions to next haze some pledges and makes him realize that one of them had made fun of Evan himself. And so Evan decides to rattle off the Greek alphabet to make him seem smart from this guy, to just tell him to shut the F up. So Evan tries to do a special night for Kaylee that ends up getting ruined by Hunter telling Evan that his car is vandalized. So they realize that it was Tommy who had done that, and Evan goes to get his pepper spray from his dorm, or his fraternity, or wherever he's at now. So Evan talks to Kaylee about how she, when she was a kid, was to be spared from Miller ever hurting her because he would save it all up for Tommy. So, really telling us that Tommy is now very scarred and very traumatized from probably all of that just hitting and smacking and whatever for all that time. So Evan and Kaylee go out together and talk about how different Evan is now. They see Evan's coat, like this yellow one that's just kind of off to the ground, and then Tommy all of a sudden appears out of the shadows. Tommy, bitter that Evan has everything, even to the point of having Tommy's sister, and we have this fight that, of course, is to happen. Evan is to spray Tommy with mace, and when Tommy kind of falls down, we then have Evan who is take and start to punch into Tommy, and gets to the point where Evan is just so upset with Tommy for all the stuff that he had gone on and done in the past, to where Evan beats Tommy to death. So while that's going on, Kaylee's running off to this kind of button to alert the police. So we come to find out that Evan is going to prison so that way he can go on to be somebody's puppet. And Evan at some point is to go on and talk to his mother within prison and state that she feels that Evan will probably get off with self-defense, but there's no guarantee there. So Evan has a cellmate named Carlos, telling him to be somewhere else in his head when people probably come for him, because they probably will. As Evan is to make his way to Carlos, I'm like, man, like, the actor that actually plays Carlos in this movie, I'm like, oh my god, like, you would have never thought that this guy would be this guy. And so when I went through, like, the IMDb page, I'm like, oh my god, this is this actor? Wow, that's really interesting. And who it was of course, to be Kevin Durand, the guy that was to be for movies like Legion, or to go on and be like the Blob in like Wolverine Origins, and like all kinds of other things that more than likely it's like, well, hey man, like, say something that people would actually recognize him from. But anyways, just kind of look him up. He was also in like Real Steel, that Hugh Jackman movie. Maybe people will know that. But so anyways, Evan gets his food taken away from him at lunchtime, and Carlos gives him some of his. Evan talks to his mother and says she is sure that, like, this is the point where she talks about, like, well, I think he'll get off with a self-defense whole thing. And so Evan's like, oh, okay, all right. So Evan talks to Evan asks if his mother brought him his notebooks, and she of course did. She can only get two of them, and Evan's like, no, I need all of them. And she's like, these are the only ones that I could bring. Like, I'm sorry, like, they're all up in storage somewhere. And he's like, crap. So Evan bumps into a guy named Carl, who's to be the villain, I guess, in this prison. So we come to find that these guys are to see this notebook and start tearing pages out of course, Evan's notebook. So Carl grabs Evan, telling him that they'll be coming for him tonight. I'm assuming for a puppet show. I'm gonna make you my puppet. And so Carl is to go on and read one of these passages from this notebook, while Evan is going on and mopping one of the prison floors later on. So telling us that, like, yeah, Carl is coming for this guy. So Evan talks to Carlos about God working in mysterious ways, and trying to convince Carlos here. It's like, well, hey man, like, if you help me out, like, I can go on and like, make your problems go away, and I'm a time traveler, and now I want to show you this fact. So Evan goes back in time when he was in school to convince Carlos that he is a time traveler. And so, and he goes on to draw the whole stabbing of the prisoners thing, as well as him stabbing his hands into these needle things, and while having this Boswell like look on. So when Evan goes back to Carlos is like, oh my god, this is like some stigmata stuff, like this is weird. As Evan had gone on to tell Carlos, is like, well, hey, like kind of make sure like you're watching my hands or watching anything, and so that way like I can prove to you that this is the truth. So we have Carlos that absolutely believes Evan. It's like, all right, so Carlos gives Evan this pack of cigarettes. So Evan goes to Carl to make a deal, saying like, well, hey, like I know I have to join a gang, so I might as well kind of join you guys. So what do I need to do? So we have Evan, who is to assume a position that he's going to be giving a little blowy here soon. And so what ends up happening instead, that Evan will be coming to blows after all, as Evan stabs into Carlos's junk, just starts stabbing into him. Pretty gruesome, as Carlos comes in to knock out a guy named Rick, who is to be the kind of the blonde-haired guy who's like, well, hey man, you better like watch out with that teeth, and I'm gonna make you my puppet. Anyway. Why do I always have that joke? Anyways, it's funny to me. But so, Evan now is to grab his notebook and is to desperately try to flash back to the junkyard as Carlos is trying to keep the prison cell door closed while people are desperately trying to get in. So Evan flashes back to the junkyard where Evan gives Lenny a sharp object to cut the sack. Here we go with sack jokes. And so Evan notices Tommy. And so we have Tommy who is trying to convince, we have Evan that is trying to convince Tommy to not go through with this, that he'll end up in juvie for sure. And so, hey man, like just don't do this. Just think about your life. Tommy realizes that this is a big mistake. He opens the sack and Lenny stabs in the back anyways. So we have Kaylee's face now scared, and Lenny sitting by a fire. Evan realizes he has come back to his dorm back in now current time, but it's now slightly different. Like as if the room has bizarrely changed a tweed bit. So Evan is having a seizure that sees Lenny go to the mental hospital, and he's going to be staying there for a good long while. And now Kaylee has hitchhiked to eventually become a woman of the night, it seems. Oh, one thing I messed up about, like Kaylee, in the flashback in the junkyard, she had got her face scarred. I think I said scared instead of scarred. My bad. So we come to find out that Thumper had found Evan seizuring away, and Thumper is to try to call out for help as he sees Evan is, of course, to be in the condition he is. Evan talks to Redfield and his mother about his MRI results, as Evan asks if Jason had similar results in his brain, and they said that there was never a way for them to have gone on do these kind of procedures that, of course, they can do now on Evan from like Jason, I guess, could not have gone on and done MRIs to kind of see the brain progression. But I guess since now they can, like they can do this with Evan, which they couldn't have done with Jason. So, anyways, Redfield talks about Evan's brain and that Evan tells his mom he has kind of changed up his whole brain, and it's overloading with memories. So Evan leaves while also stealing Redfield's pass card to talk to Lenny, Evan. Let me pause here for a second. Alright. So Evan makes his way to Lenny, and we have Evan who's to kind of crack jokes like, well, hey, like, maybe we should bring in all these model planes in here, and so on and so forth. And so we go on to have Lenny that asks if Evan knew what was going to happen when Evan put the shard in Lenny's hand. And so if Evan knew that, then Lenny states that Evan should be like exactly where he is now, where Evan should be in the mental hospital and Lenny should be fine, happy, carefree, and whatever. So Evan again goes to read from off of his notebook again so he can see his father in the Institute from a flashback. The whole part where Evan had finally gone on to see his dad. Evan is hoping that possibly Jason could have some answers for him, which of course he won't. But so Jason notices that Evan had kind of shifted as if he kind of went elsewhere. And so Jason immediately knows that Evan is acting different or is different. And so we have Evan who is desperately asking Jason if there's any way that he can go on and correct what he has done. And Jason says there is no correcting, and he's playing God, and this curse should have ended with Jason instead of going on to Evan. And so that goes on to lead the more and more that they are talking. Evan states, like, well, hey, I'll send you a postcard when I made the world perfect again. And Jason goes on to grab Evan, chokes him out, and that's where we are to realize what happened from the flashback. So Evan then goes on to the diner where he then is to kind of really be holding on to his meal and is to kind of be like, hey, don't touch my food. And we have this waitress is like, well, hey, did you just get out of the pen there, buddy? And we have Evan that's like, what are you talking about? And the waitress is like, well, yeah, I had a person that just got out of prison who eats like that. So, like, I know, like, that from my own personal experience of seeing a person eat like that. So, Evan asks about Kaylee working at this diner, and the woman is like, well, no, she never worked here. So, Evan goes to Mr. Miller's home to ask if Kaylee is to be living anywhere near here and where is the address. Evan goes on to grab Mr. Miller aggressively and kind of like presses him against this wall like, hey, like it seems that all kinds of insults never really work on you, but hey, like I'm going to keep doing them anyways. So we have Evan that goes on to choke out Miller for the information, and he gives it to him. So Kaylee answers the door to find that Evan is waiting there in front of her to talk, as we find Kaylee is making money off of her body, And so she's stating like, well, hey, like, how long are you going to be? Because time is money. So Evan tells Kaylee his whole entire story, as Kaylee doesn't believe him, of course, because no one would. And Evan tells Kaylee secrets that only she would know about her feet going numb when she climaxes, or that she hates cilantro because it reminds her of her sister, and so on and so forth. So we have Evan that doesn't care about his wallet, as Kaylee is to be thumbing through it, and Evan's like, yeah, I don't need the wallet where I'm going. And I'm like, is this kind of like the Back to the Future thing? It's like, where's the road? Hey, we don't need roads where we're going. So, because Evan again is going to go back in time to try again to correct what he did. And so the conversation that technically he's having with Kaylee doesn't really even matter right now. So Evan can tell her everything, and it really wouldn't matter to him because he's going to adjust the timeline anyways. So we have, of course, have Evan that states every time Evan goes back to help someone, things just get worse, not better. Kaylee tells Evan where he should have gone back to, and Evan goes back to his dorm to go back to stop the woman and baby from the blockbuster by warning them. But the mailbox explodes right in front of Evan instead, having Tommy go on and kind of grab the woman and her baby and kind of put them to safety. Lenny and Kaylee kind of run off and do their thing, but they're okay. But we come to find out that Evan is going to get the brunt of it from this mailbox because he's the closest one there. So we go on to have Evan that wakes up back at his dorm room, and he is to be hearing two people just banging around, assuming that it's Thumper and the woman that he was with, because of course when Evan would go into his dorm room, Thumper is at it again. He's thumping away. So we have instead us realize that this is not Thumper, that this is actually Lenny who is banging some woman, which we have to assume is to be Kaylee. Because we come to find out when Evan is to get all these flashbacks that we also have him realize that he no longer has hands. Neither one of them, left or right. And so within this flashback, we come to find out that Lenny and Kaylee had fallen in love with one another. They had probably sneaked away to confess their love, as eventually Evan had forcibly found out about it and would probably go on really be holding a grudge about that. So, bizarrely enough, everything is perfect in this world with the exclusion of Evan's own person, or to also find out somewhere in this thing that Evan's mother is not exactly in the best of health either. So Evan falls out of his wheelchair wanting to go back to read one of his notebooks, and that Lenny should help him do that because at least Lenny owes Evan that because of stealing his girl. So Evan finds Tommy normal, as he is even religious. He has found religion. Aha! This man is to finally clean up his act. It took most of a movie, but he did it. Tommy took credit for saving the mom and baby, and Evan's like, well, of course he would have, because he's an a-hole. So Evan asks Kaylee when they're by themselves, and is to really just kind of lay it on thick at some point here, of if their relationship between Evan and Kaylee could have worked out. And Kaylee's like, well, yeah, I could imagine like the whole movie of us together and how it could have been perfect and this and that. But she says, it's like, well, yeah, but I'm with Lenny now. And like, that's not going to change. So Evan even goes on to further confess his love to Kaylee and how it was like the only one for me and this and that. And so Lenny is to just kind of be off in the background, just kind of waving. And so Kaylee completely ignores what Evan even just said and is to walk off to be with Lenny, where Evan is to see them two kissing. It's like, great! You! that! But anyways, so Evan tries to drown himself as Tommy is to find him within this tub. And he tells him, like, well, hey, man, you forgot to put the toaster on the ledge. And Evan's like, man, I can't even end myself the way I want to. So, because everybody's just having the best of times, besides Evan. So, we have Evan that finds his mother in the hospital as Tommy makes his way with Evan in the wheelchair I think Lenny and Kaylee do. Something along those lines. So Evan goes to the hospital and sees that instead of his mother working at this hospital, she's now a patient there, and her health has really declined because she has lung cancer, we come to find out in this story. So Evan realizes he's going to fix this, and Andrea says Evan is talking more and more like Jason, and they're starting to sound the same, and we, of course, have Andrea that's like, no, don't try to do what Jason did. Don't do it. Just don't. So Evan goes back to a time where he was to be young, to not have the blackout time to be able to do much of anything, because he grabs this knife and it's like, well, yeah, I want to try to like destroy the Blockbuster, and like he's not realizing that he's not old enough to be able to destroy that, or he's not at the perfect blackout time, so it doesn't make sense. So we then have Evan go back to the Robin Hood movie time period. So Evan mentions about getting a belt to Mr. Miller, and Mr. Miller's like, no, you're not going to need a belt for this. So Evan instead goes on to grab the Blockbuster instead, threatening Miller with it. As Evan lights the Blockbuster, Miller grabs Evan, and the Blockbuster comes out of Evan's hand to then go into the grasp of Kaylee's, and we then realize that Kaylee is going to explode and die here. So Evan sees he ended up in Sunnyvale Institute in his youth with the flashback that he now forcibly has. And so now he's been at Sunnyvale Institute all along. So we, of course, have Evan now in this bed, and he is covering his nose, realizing he's going to be getting a gush of blood. And so we have Evan that runs off to meet up with Dr. Redfield, looking for his notebooks. We go and have Dr. Redfield that tells Evan, it's like, what notebooks are you talking about? These notebooks never existed, but you go on and continue to ask about them. And he's also to talk about how Evan was to be talking about all these alternative timelines. So it seems that somehow Evan has to have been figuring out and talking to this to his doctor and telling him everything. So we go on to have Dr. Redfield that is to state, it's like, well, yeah, like, you and your father's case are very drastically similar because your father would go on and talk about this photo album that he never had either. So, and Evan's like, wait a minute, photo album? And so he's like, aha, maybe there's something that I could use here. So, Evan all of a sudden is to be falling over as Redfield tells Andrea it's surprising Evan still has even his motor functions left, as he used to have so much crammed in their memory. So we have Evan that interjects between the conversation of his mother and Dr. Redfield. And so Evan goes on to ask, well, hey, Mom, have you decided to bring over these home movies that I asked you about? And we would, of course, have his mother that goes on, like, well, yeah, like, I have. And so he's like, okay, great, because I really want to look into them. So we have Redfield that is talking to Andrea. It's like, well, hey, like, he needs to get transferred soon, like tomorrow, to a place that can probably better help him. So Evan sneaks into Redfield's office to write the last note of which that we had saw in the beginning of this whole thing, but now we're seeing here again. So the note to try and state that he's going to save Kaylee. So as the video of the projector starts to roll, we find out that this is to be tied to Andrea's pregnancy. And so Evan is to hope that he can somehow use this to kind of go back to this time, because Evan is going to stop himself from getting born. And so because of the whole thing where the fortune teller was to tell him that he should never have gotten born, and like how Evan was to probably see this as his only way out, that maybe if he was not there doing any of this, that maybe a lot of it would not have happened. So we have Evan that stops himself from being born, and we next see that Tommy and Kaylee go back to their mother's home. After all, Lenny is having some happy birthday party. Tommy is to be the speaker of his own graduation, and Andrea is having a child with some other guy. And then we see at the end of this that Kaylee is to get married with some guy, and it all works out. And so that's how the movie ends. And so I'm going to try to quickly get out of here because I realize that this is like almost like a 2-hour film, and I've talked for a good chunk of time. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.